Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Thursday, September 22nd, 2022. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com, Putin did what we expected him to do. Early Wednesday morning, he gave a televised address, and he ordered a partial mobilization and warned Western countries that Moscow would use nuclear weapons to defend its territory. So this move, it marks Putin's biggest escalation of the war in Ukraine since he launched the invasion on February 24th. So this partial mobilization will call up 300,000 reservists. Um, but Putin is still framing the war as a special military operation. But he said in this speech, this is his warning to the West on nuclear weapons. He said, quote, if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will, without a doubt, use all available means to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff. The citizens of Russia can rest assured that the territorial integrity of our motherland, our independence and freedom will be defended, I repeat, by all the systems available to us. Those who are using nuclear blackmail against us should know that the weather vane can turn around. End quote. So that's a pretty explicit warning there. And also in this speech, he expressed support for the referendums that were announced on Tuesday that will be held in the Donbass and in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. He said of those referendums, quote, I would like to emphasize that we will do everything necessary to create safe conditions for these referendums so that people can express their will, and we will support the choice of future made by the majority of people in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, end quote. So this means, these referendums are scheduled to be held from September 23rd to the 27th. So that's soon. That's Friday, starting Friday. And so if they hold these referendums and they vote to join Russia and Russia absorbs these regions, now that means that it seems to mean that attacks on these regions that will be done with U.S. and NATO weapons would be considered attacks on Russian territory. So if you see that threat he's making, this just shows the danger, and this danger has always been there, and this is always going to be the result of the U.S. policy. Instead of pushing for diplomacy to end the war, they've been shipping tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons into the war zone and discouraging peace talks, which we'll get more into in a minute here. But this is just where this was going to lead, and now he's out there threatening to use nuclear weapons. So Putin, he made clear in this speech that he blames the U.S. and its allies for the current situation, and he said that a peace deal was possible earlier in the war after Russian and Ukrainian negotiators held talks in Istanbul. And he's not the only one that said this. There's been other reports, most recently in Foreign Affairs. It was an article written by Fiona Hill, of all people, but it cited former U.S. officials who said that a tentative deal was agreed on between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, a potential deal. There's still a long way to go before, uh, you know, something was really implemented, but a tentative deal was agreed on. And it's not just that report in Foreign Affairs. There was also a report in Ukrainian media that said a deal was close, but it was sabotaged by Boris Johnson, who went to visit Ukraine after these talks and said, don't negotiate with Russia, even if you're ready to sign a deal. We, the collective West, are not. And this also reflects, at the time of these talks, after the talks in Istanbul, the comments from just Russian officials, Russian negotiators. It sounded like Turkish negotiators, not negotiators, but Turkey brokered the talks. They said a deal is going to happen. It seemed like there was really something on the table, which would have involved Ukraine declaring neutrality, recognizing Crimea as Russia, and either recognizing the independence of the Donbass or giving them, autonomy. But that was scuttled. And Putin said that he was revealing the details of these peace talks for the first time. He said, quote, after the start of the special military operation, in particular after the Istanbul talks, Kiev representatives voiced quite a positive response to our proposals. These proposals concerned, above all, ensuring Russia's security and interests. End quote. And he also said that this a peaceful settlement did not suit the West, which is why he says that Kiev was ordered by the West to wreck these agreements. And again, there's that report from Ukrainska Pravda, which is Ukrainian media, pro-Kiev outlet, that said Boris Johnson went to Kiev and said, "No, don't sign this deal." So the Russian leader, he said that Washington, London, and Brussels were now openly encouraging Kiev to move hostilities to our territory. And since that Kharkiv offensive, there have been more attacks, more reports of shelling inside Russian territory. And so this is just, we're going to see an escalation here. It looks like he still made clear that the focus was going to be on liberating, quote unquote, liberating the Donbass region. Russia controls virtually all of the Luhansk Oblast, but there's still territory in Donetsk that is controlled by Ukraine. So I think that's what this next phase is still going to be focused on, just with more manpower. And we might see more attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power grids, transportation, things that Russia hasn't really done much before. Okay, so the next one here. At the UN General Assembly, Biden says Russia cannot take a country's territory by force. So President Biden delivered a speech at the UN General Assembly in New York on Wednesday after Putin's speech, they said it was altered after Putin made his speech. And, it really just highlighted the U.S. hypocrisy on this issue and why I think a lot of the world is not following along with the U.S. in its policy on the war in Ukraine. So Putin said, quote, Biden said, quote, Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter, no more important than the clear prohibition against countries taking the territory of their neighbor by force, end quote. So again, these comments highlight U.S. hypocrisy because as Biden is saying this, the U.S. occupies a major portion of Syria, about 1/3 of the country. They occupy eastern Syria. They back Kurdish forces in the region to the opposition of the government in Damascus. They're opposed to it. It's an illegal occupation. And the U.S., of course, also supports Israel's occupation of the West Bank, its blockade of Gaza, and Saudi Arabia's war and blockade on its neighbor, Yemen. Because if you notice, when Biden said that, he included the word neighbor in there. But over in the Arabian Peninsula, the U.S. has supported this brutal war and blockade that the Saudis have imposed on their neighbor, Yemen. Wouldn't be possible without U.S. support, that war. So Biden said that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia based on the principle that you cannot seize a nation's territory by force. And I didn't, in this article, it's pretty short, I didn't get into Biden's history, because when he was in the Senate, he was one of the major proponents for George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. And when he was in the Obama administration, he was part of a government that launched a war against Libya, Syria, started the Saudi war in Yemen. And there's just so many examples of them violating a country's territory very grossly. So I think it shows why you see like African countries and many Asian countries just not going along, because it's just the U.S. is so hypocritical on the world stage just all the time. I mean, this is just the latest example. And Biden also accused Putin of making reckless nuclear threats. He said, quote, President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime, end quote. So U.S. support for Ukraine in its war against Russia has escalated tensions to the point where many experts and officials believe there is now a greater risk of nuclear war today than there was during the Cold War. But that doesn't seem to be factored in to the U.S. calculation because the U.S. shows no sign of backing down, and Putin's moves signal a Russian escalation. So the escalations continue. The escalation ladder keeps going. And I'm going to take that to mention our sponsor, How the West Brought War to Ukraine by Benjamin Abloh, because it's just all about how U.S. and Western provocations after the Cold War have provoked this war and led to this situation. And, this book, it doesn't justify the invasion, but it teaches the lessons of how we got here. And people need to understand these lessons if we want to end this, because if we think that we just have to keep supporting Ukraine, I mean, we're just entering such dangerous territory now. And this book, it's just great because it's short, 60 to 70 pages. You could read it in one day. You could give it to friends, family to read if they want to understand the situation better. And the author has said, if you buy this book and you like it and you're part of some kind of group, if you're a part of an anti-war group, a religious group, whatever it is, you could contact him, send him an email, which you could find his email in the back of the book, to buy bulk copies, and he could give you a good discount for that. Just if you want to spread it amongst your community, whatever it is that you're doing. How the West Brought War to Ukraine. It's only $10, and it's just a great book on this issue. There's not really any other books like it right now. The link to purchase it is in the description, and it helps support the show, and a great author. All right, back into the news. Let's see, what's the next one? The Baltic states will not give refuge to Russians fleeing mobilization. So the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia will not welcome Russians who want to flee Russia after Putin ordered this partial mobilization that will call up 300,000 reservists as part of his preparations to escalate in Ukraine. So the Baltic nations have virtually banned all Russian travelers from entering their territory, and they won't make exceptions for Russians who want to avoid being drafted. The Estonian foreign minister told Reuters, quote, a refusal to fulfill one's civic duties in Russia or a desire to do so does not constitute sufficient grounds for being granted asylum in another country, end quote. So you see really how this policy of banning most Russians is a policy that's really collective punishment for the population of Russia. They're all being punished for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, which you just have to imagine if Americans were held to this standard. There's wars going on that the U.S. is involved in that Americans don't even know about. So by this, now you see Russians are starting to, this partial mobilization, it sparked some protests in Russia, and there was anti-mobilization protests across the country, and over 1,000 Russians have been detained, according to this Russian human rights group, OVD Info. So there's definitely opposition to this mobilization, and there was anti-war protests when the war was first launched. But instead of welcoming the Russians that don't want to go fight the war, they're going to turn them away, the Baltic states and the EU, really, because right now Russians can't fly into the EU. The only way to go is to enter countries that border Russia. But they've closed off their borders to Russians. And this policy of banning Russians, it came after Zelensky called for the West to ban all Russians, saying that the whole population of Russia was responsible for the war. So again, it's just this collective punishment. In this mobilization, again, it applies to reservists, and they say it's only 1% of the 25 million available reservists in Russia. So there's a chance that they could mobilize further and kind of launch a full-scale nationwide draft. And I think some Russians are definitely going to want to get out of there if that happens. But the EU looks like they're going to turn them away, which just goes against so much of what they say this is all about. This sanctions campaign is all about. It's just more hypocrisy, I think, from the NATO countries. All right. The next one, this is just a quick one, short article from Reuters that says European governments have spent €500 billion on the energy crisis so far. And this is according to a report published by the think tank Bruegel. And it says that The EU's 27 countries have collectively allocated 314 billion euros for measures to ease the pain brought on by soaring gas prices, while Britain has set aside 178 billion euros. So it's just an example of how the sanctions have really backfired on the West. They're spending this much money, and winter hasn't even arrived yet. All right, next article, we're going to get into China and Taiwan. The China hawks in Congress are happy over Biden's Taiwan comments about defending the island. So China hawks in Congress, they see President Biden's recent comments on defending Taiwan as encouragement to push forward a major piece of legislation that would overhaul U.S. policy toward the island. And this is according to a report from Politico. Biden said this on Sunday, that the U.S. would send troops to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack, marking the fourth time that he made the pledge. Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, who is spearheading the Taiwan Policy Act, he said that the comment from Biden surprised him since the White House expressed reservations about the bill. So this Taiwan Policy Act, which I've talked about a lot, it would give Taiwan $6.5 billion in military aid, give them the benefits of being a major non-NATO ally, and require sanctions as a response to Chinese aggression toward Taiwan. Among other things, the bill would do other things too as well. On top of all that, it would just radically change U.S. policy toward Taiwan. But after the bill was introduced by Menendez, and he introduced it with Lindsey Graham, the White House expressed some concerns, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee made some minor changes to the bill, including it was originally going to designate Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally, but now it changed the language to say it would just give them that benefit without making the designation. And actually, while they were tweaking it, they added $2 billion in military aid for Taiwan. The original bill was $4.5 billion. So they kind of tweaked it in the other direction in some ways. But so Menendez said, quote, "That's why I think it's crazy that they pushed back on our bill. That's why I think some of my colleagues are off base when they worry about strategic ambiguity. Look, the president has said this not once, not twice, but 4 times now," end quote. So Menendez is basically saying Biden's saying he's going to defend Taiwan. This means it's strange that they push back on our bill, and my colleagues that are concerned about changing the policy of strategic ambiguity, it's already being changed by Biden. He's making it pretty clear. And his comments were the most explicit on Taiwan. I don't want to get too much into it just because I've been covering it so much lately. But really, strategic ambiguity means the U.S. isn't supposed to say one way or the other if it would defend Taiwan, and that's supposed to signal to China, send signals to both China and Taiwan. But the White House did not walk back Biden's remarks as they did the previous times he said it, because he said this 4 times. And his top Asia official on the National Security Council said it wasn't a walk back. They're trying to say that policy hasn't changed, but they can say that, but it's clear that something is changing here. And China has warned that this Taiwan Policy Act would shake the foundation of U.S.-China relations. On Wednesday, China reiterated that its goal is peaceful reunification. And this was the China's spokesman for their Taiwan Affairs Office, who handles Taiwan policy. He said, quote, "I would like to reiterate that we are willing to strive for the prospect of peaceful reunification with the greatest sincerity and utmost efforts," end quote. So China has always says that that's their goal, peaceful unification, but they don't rule out the use of force, and they have explicitly warned that U.S. support for Taiwan's independence forces could lead to war, and that's what all this support is to them. It's the U.S. signaling to what they call Taiwan's independence forces, Taiwanese secession forces. The next one here, this is from the Libertarian Institute, from Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman. The head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, he said that Beijing's support for the war in Ukraine and its opposition to NATO expansion justifies the alliance, labeling China as a challenge to the alliance, as they say, really calling China a threat to the military alliance, the North Atlantic military alliance that's looking to expand into Asia. So largely in response to Washington's increasing hostility, Moscow and Beijing have strengthened their ties for a while now. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, China and Russia started carrying out more military exercises together. And Putin and Xi have met several times since the war began. And while China has not given public support for Moscow's war, their position is still that they want peace talks. They want it to end. That's what they say publicly. China has refused several demands to condemn Russia's invasion, and Beijing has drastically increased trade by buying all this oil, which is helping Russia out. So Stoltenberg is saying, yeah, this shows that China is a threat to us because they're not following us. They're not doing what we want them to do when it comes to Russia. All right. So the next one here, Raisi, the Iranian president, he also spoke at the UN General Assembly. And just quick, just because we still have a lot of stuff to go through, he basically said that Iran is serious about reviving the nuclear deal. We're still ready to negotiate. And he questioned the U.S. commitment of negotiations, the U.S. commitment to reviving this Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And he said, really, Iran needs guarantees. We can't trust the West. We can't trust the U.S. They already pulled out of this deal before. We need some sort of guarantees. And we don't know exactly what Iran has asked for in the negotiations because Biden doesn't have the power to give these guarantees. And in previous negotiations, he rejected to make a promise to just stay in the JCPOA for his term in office. And that was the previous Iranian government of Hassan Rouhani. But so that's where we stand. The negotiations are still stalled. The next one here, this is big news. The U.S. bombed Somalia, and they are saying that they killed 27 al-Shabaab fighters. So the U.S. launched an airstrike in Somalia on September 18th. U.S. Africa Command said on Wednesday, as the Biden administration continues to escalate its war against al-Shabaab. So according to AFRICOM, this strike was done in support of the Mogadishu-based government and killed 27 al-Shabaab fighters, which is a significant amount of people to say that were killed in this bombing. AFRICOM claimed that no civilians were killed in the strike, but the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, especially in Somalia, where its operations are shrouded in secrecy. We should not believe what the Pentagon says about their airstrikes in Somalia. The strike was launched near the village of Bulo Barde, if I probably said that wrong, but it was in the central Haran region in Somalia. And AFRICOM said that the bombing allowed the Somali National Army and the African Union's transition mission in Somalia to regain momentum. So this, the U.S.-backed government in Somalia, they said that over the weekend they killed over 100 al-Shabaab fighters and recaptured several villages in this region. And that was when the airstrikes were launched on September 18th, around that time. So over the past few months, the U.S. has escalated its war in Somalia after Biden ordered the redeployment of up to 500 troops to the East African nation. That happened back in May. And we've seen a lot of airstrikes since then. The last ones, the last known, it's important to say the last known U.S. airstrikes because the CIA also launches airstrikes, drone strikes in Somalia, and they don't report them like AFRICOM does. And but the last known U.S. airstrikes took place on August 14th, which AFRICOM said killed 13 al-Shabaab fighters. So the U.S. military, they portray al-Shabaab as this major threat because they are affiliated with al-Qaeda. But it's just important to note that al-Shabaab was born out of fighting a U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion. And we know, thanks to WikiLeaks, that the U.S. really twisted Ethiopia's arm into invading Somalia in 2006. And then the first recorded al-Shabaab attack was against Ethiopian troops that were occupying Mogadishu. So al-Shabaab, they didn't declare loyalty to al-Qaeda until 2012 after years of fighting the U.S. and its proxies. So there's no reason to think al-Shabaab is any sort of global threat. They're regional, and it's clear why they ended up declaring loyalty to al-Qaeda because of U.S. intervention in the region. So again, I just want to stress, we don't know what's happening on the ground in Somalia. Whenever journalists or human rights organizations get to the scene of a U.S. airstrike there, it's usually a much different story. They usually find civilian casualties. So just always keep that in mind when you see these stories about Somalia. But it's unfortunate that it looks like the U.S. is really escalating its war there. The next one here is from Jason Ditz, and this is just an article about how Iraq's oil ministry is warning companies not to buy from the Kurds. So that's Iraq's central government, based out of Baghdad, and then there's the Kurdistan region. So after the U.S. occupation, the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, they were free to make side deals on oil, which was a good revenue source for them. But then after the ISIS war, the central government sought to curtail such sales, making it a central government issue on the grounds that they need money. So they're just looking for more control over the Kurdish region. Really, it's just an example of how the complications of the situation, after this U.S. regime change, um, and we're still seeing those effects today. Okay, so the last one here, another one from Kyle and Connor at the Libertarian Institute, and it's about Rashida Tlaib, the congresswoman, the House representative. She's demanding an investigation into the murder of Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Ekla, and saying that progressives need to rethink their support of Israel. Now, I don't think this is going to spur any kind of real investigation pushed by the U.S., but it's definitely significant that there are members of Congress now that are willing to push back and speak out and call for the U.S. to leverage aid to Israel over its human rights abuses. And it really is just amazing that a Palestinian American journalist could get shot in the face by Israeli forces, and the U.S. not even really put any pressure on Israel deliberately. It looks like from all investigations that she was shot and she was wearing a bulletproof vest that said press in the West Bank, and we're just not seeing the U.S. put any pressure on them. But it's good to see at least some people in Congress are speaking out about it. Okay, that's it for the news. That was a lot of stuff. I hope I didn't blow through it too quick. I mean, the big story of the day is this escalation that we're going to see in the war in Ukraine, it looks like. And that's what all of our viewpoints are about for the most part. We have a great one from Ray McGovern. We have a great one from David Stockman titled, "What in the Hell Was Washington Thinking?" Which could be a title for, a lot of things. We have another great one from Ted Snyder. So go there and read all that stuff. It's really good quality content, and it's just a shame the situation we found ourselves in, where it looks like there's just no de-escalation in sight here, and things can get really, really bad, and a lot of people are going to die. But you can contact the show, news@antiwar.com, buy some antiwar.com t-shirts and stuff in the link below. And October 8th in Washington, D.C. at the Department of Justice, there's a rally for Julian Assange at 12 p.m. I want everybody that can to attend to that. It's just so important. I have to get more details. I keep meaning to, but for the next show, I'm going to prepare more details about the rally, give you guys some more speakers that will be there. But that's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.